He was of course quite old by then, but he was a very staunch figure on the left. He was not a Marxist, he was what was called an institution. He called himself an institutionalist. And he wrote two outstanding books. One, of course, was the race question in the United States, which was called The American Dilemma, and the other was about the Asian drama. Most of you would probably be familiar with the Asian drama, but Asian drama was actually preceded by the American Dilemma, which was the race question. Now, Young Myrdal's book is a remarkable book for two very obvious reasons. Firstly, it is a collection of posters which actually are relatively we hardly would get a chance to see such posters. And secondly, along with the posters, there is a very deep, knowledgeable text that actually follows. And that text, even though, in fact, as His Excellency the Swedish diplomat said, that text is not a particularly left-wing text. In fact, that's a text where Young Myrdal is extremely restrained, but it's very insightful. There are lots of things there which he says which are quite remarkably insightful. So in a sense, looking at these posters and looking at the text, you get an introduction to European history of that particular period. In fact, it's a marvelous introduction to European history of that period. Reading through it, certain questions come. Certain questions, certain silences, certain intriguing issues come to one's mind. And I just use this opportunity to flag two intriguing issues which come to my mind when I read the text. As you know, most of the posters are about France in Italy, but fundamentally France. One question that comes is that the First World War was a horrible war as far as the people, the soldiers, and all sides were concerned. Quite apart from the high incidence of death, there was tuberculosis, there were venereal diseases, there were rats, there were lice. It was like living in death. Given that, soldiers everywhere revolted against the war. The Bolshevik Revolution was a response to the war. The Russian soldiers revolted against the war and carried out a revolution. In Germany, while they did not succeed in carrying out a revolution, they actually had revolutionary attempts. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht died as a result of these revolutionary attempts. In Hungary, you have the Budapest Commune, with which Georgi Lukács was associated. So everywhere, the war produced such great revulsion among the soldiers that you actually had a revolutionary uprising. Some succeeded, some did not. But in France, there was none. And that is quite remarkable. You look at the book and you find in all the French posters and so on, there is no, Young Myrdal discusses in great and poignant detail how much the French soldiers suffered. But at the same time, there was no revolutionary attempt in France, which is a very intriguing question. It's a question that really leads one, and it's a question that haunts one. Perhaps there is an answer.
Excuse me, please.
Perhaps there is an answer which emerges from the book, not directly, but perhaps indirectly, and that is the following. France already was a republic. France had had a bourgeois revolution in 1789. As a result, unlike in Germany, in fact, Young Myrdal discusses, in Germany the officer class consisted of the aristocracy, while the soldiers consisted of ordinary people. In other words, the anti-feudal revolution had not been carried out in Germany in a way it was carried out in France. France actually, the officers, the soldiers, everybody belonged to ordinary people. There was no aristocracy, man as it were the officer class. It was unthinkable in the German army for a common person to actually become an officer. So in a sense, the bourgeois revolution in France, which had actually produced Republican France, was perhaps responsible for giving a kind of structure to the army, where the disillusionment of the soldiers, the anger of the soldiers, did not really express itself in terms of an anger against the officer class, in terms of an anger against the ruling dispensation, in the same way that it produced in Germany or in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and elsewhere, and Russia. The other silence, so in a sense, the bourgeois revolution of 1789 is what prevented a proletarian revolution in 1918 in France. In a sense, if one can actually put it in a very strong way. It did, of course, produce a proletarian uprising in the Paris Commune in 1871, which was a failure. And it was a failure because the peasantry was aligned with the bourgeoisie, because the peasantry had been a beneficiary of anti-feudal reforms that gave rise to the redistribution of feudal estates. And therefore the peasantry continued to remain loyal in a sense to the republic and was not willing to make common war with the proletariat. And consequently, in France in 1918, you really did not have a proletarian uprising because it did not have adequate support from the other classes who had not witnessed, they had witnessed an anti-feudal revolution. The second silence about the book, which really is quite again intriguing, is there's a complete silence about imperialism, about the colonies. The colonies just don't figure in any of the cartoons. There's nothing in any of the posters, which again is quite remarkable. Not even in the Italian one, because Italy was like, France was an established colonial power, but Italy was newly launching a colonial venture with very little colonialism. Not that many of the painters, many of the artists were not anti-colonial. Some were, as Myrdal mentions, that some of the artists were anti-colonial. But there are no anti-colonial posters that we get, and there's complete silence on the question of colonialism, which is again quite surprising, because I believe that there is a very deep connection between imperialism and fascism. Because the point is that whatever happened in Europe in the 1930s had been tried out in the colonies before. As a matter of fact, I've seen this morning that the Nazi death camps were first tried out in Namibia. Not by the Nazis, but by German imperialists. German imperialism had in Namibia death camps that annihilated whole tribes. And exactly the same thing was taken over into Europe in the 1930s. So in a sense, fascism was the visiting of imperialist brutality onto the European soil. And that's why it was so striking that nobody in Europe had actually experienced or noticed this kind of thing, but that was happening in the colonies. There is another way in which imperialism affected fascism. And that's quite interesting that Myrdal actually emphasizes this and notes this very carefully. The First World War was financed by Germany entirely by raising domestic loans and by imposing austerity on the domestic population. In other words, they raised resources for the war by squeezing their own population. But the Second World War was one in which the Germans raised resources not by squeezing so much their own population as by squeezing the population of the conquered territories. As a matter of fact, it is the French resources, it is loans raised outside and so on which really play an important role. So in financing the German war effort, on the contrary, in fact, there was an effort to pretend that the German workers were very well off in order to give them some concessions and so on. Now this idea of getting the conquered to subsidize with their resources the imperialist venture of the conquerors is something which colonialism was all about. In fact, from India, whenever Britain fought a war in Afghanistan, if Britain fought a war somewhere else, in that case the resources for it, part of the resources were raised in India. So that if you look at the Indian government's budget of the colonial period, the Indian government's budget had an item called expenditure in England. And that expenditure in England actually meant payment for wars conducted by Britain elsewhere. It also meant the payment of interest on debt incurred for conducting wars elsewhere. So that effectively the conquered country, the colony, was really paying for wars elsewhere, which were actually being carried out by the conquering power, which is exactly what the Germans did in the Second World War. So effectively, imperial finance was carried over into fascist finance, and this is something which again shows the very close links between imperialism and fascism. There are many interesting things in the book, really quite striking things. I'll just give you one last illustration and then stop. You see, Goebbelsian propaganda, we all know that propaganda was really something that was carried out by Goebbels. As a matter of fact, this idea of showing your enemy, your opponent, as inflicting great brutality, unbelievable brutality, which is a hallmark of Goebbelsian propaganda, was first carried out, according to Myrdal, by the British. As a matter of fact, during the First World War, when you had German armies marching through Belgium, Belgium was not a combatant country, German armies marching through Belgium, there was great brutality which was inflicted upon the Belgian population. Now, on this, the British government set up a committee which was headed by political scientists, some of you political scientists, called Lord Bryce. Bryce was a very well-known political scientist of that time. And Bryce produced a report. In that report, he went in great detail how the German soldiers cut off children's arms and this and that. Horrible. But at the same time, subsequent effort by many people to find out the veracity of all these incidents have shown these incidents were not necessarily true. I mean, some brutality would have been there, of course, and some horrendous episodes could have happened, but the kind of large-scale description which Lord Bryce's report contained were descriptions that for which there was not necessarily evidence. But on the other hand, Bryce had absolutely no compunctions about saying all that. What? So Hitler praised this in Mein Kampf, saying that look at the British, they actually are carrying out war propaganda in the correct way, and we should learn from them. And so in a sense, that again, that we often miss out the origins of fascism. Fascism has multiple origins. One is of course imperialism, the other sometimes in liberal bourgeois circles itself. So I think the book in that sense is great, an eye-opener, and raises many questions. And as I said, it's a wonderful introduction to Europe.